So hi folks, so welcome back to the Astroforum channel and thanks for tuning in. In this particular video I will talk about best telescopes for planetary imaging. Now basically this is a follow-up video from last week's top 10 tips to photograph the planets. So if you didn't check out that video, I will provide a link in the video description below. In the first part of this video I will talk about the must-haves and nice-to-haves with respect to telescopes that I think are fit for planetary observations, but particularly also planetary imaging. And in the second part I'll show you what kind of telescopes are available on the market today, also depending on your budget and whether or not those telescopes meet the criteria that I have discussed in the first part of the video. The most important thing for planetary telescopes is, I think, the focal length of that telescope. Because focal length, it refers to the ability to magnify the planets with your telescope. And as you probably know, planets are very bright but also very tiny objects in the night sky. Even at the best of times, these planets are about 60 times smaller as compared to the size of the moon. So if you want to see surface details like the cloud bands and the red spot on Jupiter, the Cassini division in the rings of Saturn, or some nice surface details on Mars, you need a telescope with a long focal length. Now, my personal rule of thumb is to get a planetary telescope with a focal length of at least about 2000 millimeters, so you can really magnify the planets to a point where such surface details are visible. The second must-have I would look for in a planetary telescope is that that planetary telescope has a sufficient aperture. And as a rule of thumb, I would say that you need at least 8 inches or 200 millimeters of aperture. So let me explain what aperture is and why this is important. Now, aperture actually refers to the diameter of your telescope. So with lens-based telescopes like this one behind me, aperture refers to the size of the lens that sits in front of your telescope. For mirror-based telescopes, this refers to the size of the primary mirror that often sits at the base of your telescope. Now, lens-based telescopes actually get ridiculously expensive with an ever-increasing lens size. So you'll probably end up with a mirror-based telescope for planetary imaging. Now, why is aperture so important? Now, aperture relates to the light collecting ability of your telescope. So the larger your aperture is, the higher the resolutions of your pictures will be. So I thought it would be fun to also show you some of my attempts to engage in planetary imaging with different types of telescopes. So the first telescope I ever bought was this Celestron 102mm telescope. And I tried to engage in lunar and planetary imaging with this telescope. The focal length of this thing is about 650 millimeters. And I ended up with some very small sized pictures of the planets. There are also a number of nice-to-haves that I would look for. So the first thing is the size of the secondary mirror of a mirror-based telescope. And that's a pretty general one, so let me explain that. So most mirror-based telescopes, they have a secondary mirror that sits in front of your telescope. And that secondary mirror actually blocks part of the light that is collected by your primary mirror. Now, at the same time, the secondary mirror is essential to reach focus and increase your focal length, but the smaller that secondary mirror is, the more light your telescope is able to collect. Another nice to have to look for is portability and storability. So, my personal situation is that I live in a city center, my house is not very big, and I don't have a lot of space to store my astronomy equipment. So I prefer telescopes that do not take up a lot of space. Now also, as I'm getting older, I do want a telescope that is pretty portable and doesn't break my back every time I have to set up my astronomy equipment. So I will also look at weight and the size of the telescope. So my second telescope I bought for planetary imaging, I cannot show you that telescope anymore, but it was a classical Ritchie-Chrétien telescope, and I have some videos about that telescope. I made them last year. It had 8 inches of aperture, so 200mm aperture, and it was an f12 telescope, so it had a focal length of about 2400 millimeters. So on paper this telescope was really well suited for some planetary imaging. But unfortunately, when the telescope arrived at my doorstep, it was out of collimation, and I actually spent a couple of days and a couple of nights under the stars trying to get that telescope collimated. But it was very hard to do, and I learned that Ritchie-Chrétien types of telescopes, they actually require a laser collimator and an advanced collimation procedure in order to get the collimation right. And for me that was just a little bit too much hassle, so I returned that telescope to the astrophotography shop. A third thing that I would also look for, and that's also a little bit personal, is whether or not the planetary telescope I buy would also be usable for some deep sky astrophotography. Now, this of course again depends on your personal preferences. I'm very much into deep sky astrophotography, so one of my nice to haves when looking for a good planetary telescope is whether or not that telescope could also be used for deep sky astrophotography. Now, a fourth thing that I would look for is, if that telescope requires any kind of maintenance. I'm always looking for a telescope that requires preferably little to no maintenance. Now, most planetary telescopes will be mirror-based, and because of that, they all require some kind of collimation. But there is some variation in the frequency with which you need to collimate a mirror-based telescope, so I would always look for that as well. And the final nice to have, or the final thing I would look for, is also the price tag, of course, of that telescope. I am Dutch, so yeah, the price you are willing to pay for a good quality telescope, of course it depends on your personal budget and just the amount of money you want to spend on a planetary telescope. So there's also a third telescope that I have been using for planetary imaging, and that is this one. This is the Celestron Edge HD telescope. And I've been using this telescope not only for planetary imaging, but particularly also for some deep sky astrophotography of tinier objects like galaxies. And I really love this telescope. So this telescope, it has an aperture of 8 inches. So I should actually take off the cover. So it has an 8-inch aperture and a focal length of 2030 millimeters. So it actually meets the requirements I just mentioned in this video for planetary imaging. When it arrived on my doorstep, it was already in collimation, so I could immediately focus on the stars and the planets without getting into a collimation procedure first, so I really love that. And although we have some bad seeing conditions in the Netherlands lately, I have been able to take some decent pictures of Jupiter, Saturn and Mars, where you can actually see some surface details I've talked about of the planet. So these are the choices that I have made so far in my attempt to image the planets. And let's discuss some of these telescopes, but also other telescopes that are available on the astrophotography market today. In the second part of the video, I have transitioned to my desktop here because I want to show you 19 different telescopes that are available on the market today that I would consider when you want to engage in planetary observations and especially planetary imaging. Now, rather than discussing each of these telescopes in detail, I will compare them to the must-haves and nice-to-haves that I've mentioned in the first part of the video. And I also make a distinction into different types of telescopes. So I will discuss Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes, but also modified Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes. I will tell you the difference between those two. Maksutov Telescopes and Dobsonian Telescopes. I think these 4 types of telescopes are most popular when it comes to planetary observations and planetary imaging. Now, also I have created a dynamic table on my website. I will provide a link to all of the telescopes and that dynamic table in the video description below. So if you're interested in checking out one of these telescopes, or if you are interested in comparing one of these telescopes, please check out that comparison table. And of course, as I am not sponsored, this is not a sponsored video, I'm free to discuss different brands and different types of telescopes. So I will do that, and let's get into that comparison overview. So you will probably notice that a lot of people use Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes to get into planetary observations and planetary imaging. Now, I would say there are at least 3 reasons why people buy these SCTs, why these SCTs are so popular. The first reason is that they offer a pretty large aperture and a long focal length at a reasonable price, especially when you compare SCTs to other types of telescopes that are available on the market. So that's definitely something to consider. Second of all, they are relatively compact and portable. I have to say this goes for the lighter, lower aperture versions of SCTs. You have also some huge heavy SCTs out there. I will show you those as well in this presentation. The third thing that I want to mention is that collimation is relatively easy to accomplish with the Schmidt Cassegrain telescope. So for those of you who do not know, this is a mirror-based telescope, and as such it has a primary and a secondary mirror. Now both of these mirrors have to be aligned to get sharp views of the planets and the stars basically. Now this collimation procedure, I will not get into details about that, but it is relatively easy to accomplish on a Schmidt Cassegrain telescope. Celestron offers some interesting regular Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes. Yeah, you have the 8-inch version, the 9¼ version, the 11-inch aperture version and the 14-inch version. So each version also is accompanied by an increase in price. But also an increase in aperture, so you get a larger aperture and a longer focal length with each step. And the important thing is that, like I already explained in the first part, a longer focal length really allows you to zoom in on the planets to get this level of magnification that is necessary to detect some surface details. And also a bigger aperture allows you to collect more light, so that's also pretty important. So a larger aperture and a longer focal length usually translates into a better picture of the planets basically. So that's something to take into account, and of course with an increased aperture and focal length you also get an increase in telescope length and telescope weight. So for instance, when we look at the 9¼ inch versus the 8-inch, then the 9¼ inch is already about 56 centimeters, so 22 inches long, whereas the 8-inch is 43 centimeters or 17 inches long. And the 9¼ inch, it weighs about 9 kilos or 20 pounds, whereas the 8-inch version only weighs about 6 kilos or about 13 pounds. So these are all things to take into account depending on your personal preferences. And I have to say that regular Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes, they are good for planetary imaging, but they are not so great for deep sky astrophotography. So that is the second question I want to get into. If you want a telescope for planetary imaging, but you are also thinking about using that telescope for deep sky astrophotography, I would highly recommend you buy a modified Schmidt Cassegrain telescope, like the ones I show you here. They are much better suited for deep sky astrophotography because they are what is called Coma corrected. So now, what is Coma? When you take a picture of a deep sky object with a regular Schmidt Cassegrain telescope, you will probably notice that the stars become elongated towards the edges of your field of view, and also the stars are a little bit less in focus towards the edges of your picture. Now, modified Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes, they correct for that error basically, they correct for that Coma. And in addition, the Celestron Edge HD line also corrects for field curvature, and it has an additional fast star option. This is an option to buy an additional fast star system. You can mount that on your telescope. You need to buy that separately from the telescope. It's quite costly actually, but you will be able to turn your Edge HD telescope in a super fast f/2 ratio wide field astrophotography telescope, and that's very interesting. It's very similar to the Celestron RESA telescopes they are offering, so you can look into that if you're interested. Yeah, the Meade brand offers actually the LX200, the LX200 Advanced Coma Free Modified Schmidt Cassegrain telescope. So let's take a look at those telescopes here. So on the top you can see the Edge HD telescopes, and on the bottom you can see the LX200 Advanced Coma Free telescopes. Both are then pretty well suited for deep sky astrophotography. So the Edge HD line here is very similar to the regular Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes I already showed you. There is a small difference, of course, with the Coma correction, the field curvature correction, and the fast star option, and that also translates into a higher price. So for instance, when you look at the Edge HD 8-inch version, it is about $300 more expensive than the regular C8 version of Celestron. Yeah, and you can see that the price differences become bigger even with the 9¼ the 11-inch aperture and the 14-inch aperture telescopes. But basically in terms of aperture and focal length, they follow a similar steps as the regular Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes I already showed you. Now looking at the Meade Advanced Coma Free LX200 telescope line, it's very interesting to see that they offer 5 telescopes. So they have an 8-inch, a 10-inch, a 12-inch, a 14-inch and a 16-inch version, and you can see that also these telescopes quickly go up in price. Yeah, so what I found interesting, I cannot go into every detail right now. I would again recommend you to check out the comparison table and my blog I have written about these telescopes, but I was interested to see that the 8-inch LX200 is quite similar in terms of price and specs as the Edge HD 8-inch, but the 10-inch LX200, it offers a higher aperture and also a longer focal length as compared to the 9¼ inch at a more affordable price. So the 10-inch is $1,869, whereas the Edge HD 9¼ inch is $2,500. So that's quite a big difference, and of course the Meade doesn't have the field curvature correction and it doesn't have this fast star option, but if you're not interested in that, the Meade LX200 Advanced Coma Free line is definitely worth considering. Mount warning, yes, that's what I also wanted to get into. A lot of these Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes and modified Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes, they come with altitude azimuth mounts. So on the left hand side you can see the Next Star Evolution, on the right hand side you can see the CPC mount. These are both Celestron mounts, but the most important thing I want to make is that these are altitude azimuth mounts. Now, when you talk to a vendor or some YouTubers who are paid by these vendors, a lot of vendors say that, hey, you can buy an additional wedge with your altitude azimuth mount to engage in deep sky astrophotography. But from my personal experience and also a lot of followers on my channel who have informed me who actually use these altitude azimuth mounts, I'm quite confident in saying you are much better off at buying a German equatorial mount when you want to engage in deep sky astrophotography. So I show you some examples here from Celestron, the Advanced VX, the CGEM 2 and the CGX. Definitely this is not a Celestron video. I have to say I have the Skywatcher EQ6R Pro as my personal German equatorial mount. I have separate blogs on beginner level mounts and advanced mounts, German equatorial mounts for astrophotography. I will link to those videos and blogs in the description. The main point I want to make is when you buy a modified Schmidt Cassegrain telescope with the intention to engage in deep sky astrophotography, please also buy a good German equatorial mount with that telescope. So we're continuing with Maksutov telescopes, and often these are not considered, but they are very interesting, especially when you want to engage in planetary imaging. So there are a couple of advantages, especially when comparing the Maksutov telescopes to Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes. So I've mentioned them here. First of all, they have a smaller secondary meniscus lens, so a smaller secondary mirror basically sits at the front of a Maksutov telescope, so less light is being blocked by that secondary mirror that sits in front of the telescope, and that translates into a high resolution view because you can collect more light. Also, what is very interesting is that it has a long focal length and a high f ratio, higher as compared to most Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes with similar aperture. That means that you can really zoom in to really magnify the planets to a point where you can detect these surface details. So that's pretty interesting as well. Now, a Maksutov telescope doesn't require a lot of maintenance. It does not require, for instance, frequent collimation like Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes do. So that's also a thing to consider when you're not really in the mood for telescope maintenance. Then a Maksutov is definitely worth considering. Some things also to note is that it is a Maksutov telescope. It needs some time to reach the ambient temperature outside, so be sure to take that telescope out well before you will engage in planetary imaging. And deep sky astrophotography, I would not recommend doing that with a Maksutov telescope because of the high f ratio and the long focal length. Now, basically, there are two popular telescopes on the market right now. This is the Celestron 700 Maksutov Cassegrain. That's a pretty new one. And we have the older Skywatcher SkyMax 180 that is on the market for many years already. The aperture is 7 inches, focal length is 2700 millimeters, making them both into f15 ratio telescopes. The length and the weight and everything is pretty similar. So I would just check out the prices of the SkyMax 180 and the Celestron 700 Maksutov Cassegrain and just see which of the two telescopes are more immediately available and more affordable, and base your choice on that. And by the way, this is of course a 7-inch aperture, and I told you need at least 8 inches of aperture. But in this case, a Maksutov telescope, the obstruction of the secondary mirror, you can see it here, is only 23%. Now, if you are completely lost and you think, I'm not going to spend thousands of dollars on a telescope to watch the planets, then of course I feel for you, and I totally understand that astrophotography is basically a money pit. If you want a more affordable option to look at the planets and the stars, I would definitely recommend you start with a Dobsonian telescope. They are much more affordable. I will show you the costs on the next slide. They do offer that large aperture, so the 8-inch and 10-inch aperture Dobsonian telescopes are available for a couple of $100s. They do. What you need is an extra Barlow lens when you want to engage in planetary imaging with a Dobsonian telescope, because many Dobsonian telescopes, they have about 1200 millimeters of focal length. So you want to use an additional 2 times Barlow lens, for instance, to increase that focal length to 2400 millimeters. So take that into account. And also, Dobsonian telescopes, the cheaper ones at least, they come with a manual mount. So yeah, you need to find the planets in the night sky yourself, but some of you actually like to do that, and I also like to do that. You can engage in star hopping, and actually you get to know the night sky quite a bit better as compared to all of us who are using computerized go-to mount. Now, I think that, for instance, the Orion SkyQuest or the Skywatcher Skyliner versions, the Dobsonian versions, are very nice to start out when you don't want to spend thousands of dollars on planetary imaging, basically. So the Orion SkyQuest XT8 is already available for about $500, and the Skyliner Classic from Skywatcher is available for $485. And you have a slightly more expensive 10-inch version. The main difference is the aperture. So the aperture is 10-inch instead of 8-inch with the XT10 and the Classic 10. The focal length is the same. There are not many differences. Of course, the 10-inch version is a little bit heavier. So let me conclude here. So modified Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes, they are great for planetary imaging with the option to engage in deep sky astrophotography. The Meade LX200 Advanced Coma free line and the Celestron Edge HD line, those are definitely two telescope lines you want to consider when you want to engage in planetary imaging as well as deep sky astrophotography with the same telescope. Now, like I said before, the Edge HD is a bit more expensive, but it comes with field curvature correction and a fast star option. If you just want to engage in planetary imaging, you should also definitely consider regular Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes and Maksutov telescopes. They are a little bit cheaper to buy, and if you want to focus primarily on lunar and planetary observations and planetary imaging, I would highly advise you to look at these regular Schmidt Cassegrain telescopes and Maksutov telescopes. Yeah, finally, a Dobsonian telescope with a Barlow lens. Of course, they are very cheap alternatives if you want to get these high contrast views without breaking the bank. So I hope you liked the content of this video. I hope you got some value out of it. If you did, please consider to give this video a thumbs up and please consider subscribing to the channel. Of course, I hope to see you again in one of my other videos, and until then I want to wish you clear skies.